You know, there's a particular kind of silence that settles over a house when respect dies. It's not the comfortable quiet of contentment or the peaceful hush of evening. It's the hollow, echoing silence that follows cruel words, words that can never be taken back, words that change everything forever. I learned about that silence on a Tuesday evening in March, when my own family taught me that sometimes the people who should love you most are the ones capable of hurting you deepest. My name is Walter Henley, and I'm 71 years old. For most of my life, I believed that family meant something sacred, something unbreakable. I thought that the bonds forged in blood and strengthened through decades of shared memories were permanent fixtures in this uncertain world. I was wrong about that, but I was right about something else. Sometimes the most powerful response to cruelty isn't anger or argument. Sometimes it's simply the quiet dignity of walking away. This is the story of how I discovered that my silence wasn't weakness. It was the sound of doors closing forever. Let me start at the beginning, because understanding what came after requires knowing what came before. I wasn't born into wealth or privilege. My father, God rest his soul, worked double shifts at the steel mill for 37 years, coming home each night with hands so calloused they felt like leather and clothes that smelled of sweat and honest labor. My mother took in sewing to help make ends meet, her fingers dancing across fabric late into the night, creating beautiful dresses for other people's daughters, while my sister wore hand-me-downs with patches sewn so carefully they looked like decorations. But what my parents lacked in money, they made up for in values. They taught me that a man's word was his bond, that respect was earned through actions, not titles, and that real family stood together through good times and bad. Walter, my father used to say, settling into his worn armchair after those long days at the mill, money comes and goes, son, but character, that's what defines a man. I carried those lessons with me when I married my beloved Catherine 48 years ago. She was 19, I was 23, and we were both so poor we had to borrow folding chairs for our wedding reception in her parents' backyard. But we were rich in dreams and determination. We promised each other we'd build something better for our children than what we'd started with, and we did. Lord knows we did. I worked construction during the day and took accounting classes at night. Catherine cleaned houses for wealthy families on the other side of town, learning their habits, studying how they lived, dreaming of the day we might have something similar for ourselves. We saved every penny we could, living in a tiny apartment above Murphy's grocery store, sleeping on a mattress we bought second-hand, and cooking on a hot plate because we couldn't afford a proper stove. Our first child, Michael, was born in 1978. I remember holding him in the hospital and making a silent promise that he would never know the kind of want Catherine and I had experienced. Our daughter Helena came 2 years later, and then Andrew in 1983. 3 beautiful children who became the center of our universe. But here's something I learned about sacrifice: it's not always appreciated by those who benefit from it. When you give up your own comfort so your children can have better, they often grow up thinking that better is simply what they deserve, not something that was fought for and earned through countless small sacrifices. By the time I was 30, I'd moved from construction work to contracting. Started with small jobs fixing Mrs. Patterson's front steps, replacing the Johnsons' leaky roof. But I had a reputation for honest work at fair prices, and word spread. Soon I was bidding on commercial projects, then residential developments. The key to my success wasn't just hard work, though Lord knows I put in my share of 16-hour days. It was understanding people. I learned that wealthy clients didn't just want their projects completed, they wanted to feel heard, respected, valued. I made it a point to listen carefully to what they wanted, then deliver exactly that, often for less money than my competitors charged. By 1995, Henley Construction had grown from a one-man operation to a company employing 47 people. We specialized in high-end residential work, custom homes for doctors, lawyers, and business owners who appreciated quality craftsmanship. I was proud of what we'd built, proud of the men and women who worked for me, proud that we'd earned a reputation for integrity in an industry that didn't always reward it. Catherine had stopped cleaning houses by then and devoted herself full-time to raising our children and managing our home. She was the heart of our family, the one who remembered birthdays, organized holiday gatherings, made sure the children felt loved and supported in everything they did. Michael showed early promise in academics and went on to study business at the State University. Helena was artistic, spending hours drawing and painting, dreaming of becoming a professional artist. Andrew was our athlete, playing baseball and football with the kind of intensity that made us both proud and worried about his safety. Provided for them generously, not lavishly, but comfortably. They had nice clothes, reliable cars when they turned 16, college funds that would ensure they could pursue their dreams without the financial stress Catherine and I had endured. We took family vacations, celebrated achievements, supported their interests and ambitions, but somewhere along the way I think we made a mistake. In our desire to give them everything we'd never had, we may have forgot to teach them the value of earning it themselves. The late 1990s and early 2000s were golden years for Henley Construction. The housing market was booming and everyone wanted custom work. We completed projects that were featured in home magazines, built houses that won architectural awards, established relationships with clients who became friends. I invested wisely real estate when it was cheap, stocks in companies I understood, bonds that provided steady income. Catherine and I bought our dream home in Maple Ridge, a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial with a wraparound porch and enough land for her to plant the gardens she'd always wanted. We weren't wealthy by magazine standards, but we were comfortable in ways that would have seemed impossible during those early years above Murphy's grocery store. The children were thriving too, at least outwardly. Michael graduated with honors and immediately joined a prestigious accounting firm in the city. Helena earned her art degree and moved to Portland to pursue her career as a gallery artist. Andrew received a full scholarship to play football at a Division II school, but I began to notice subtle changes in how they related to us and to money. Birthday gifts that had once been appreciated with genuine gratitude were now met with polite thanks and comments about how they would have preferred something else. Family gatherings became less frequent as their own social circles expanded. Phone calls became shorter, focused more on their immediate needs than on maintaining connection. I told myself this was natural. Young adults were supposed to become independent, to build their own lives separate from their parents. Catherine worried more than I did, pointing out how rarely they visited, how their conversations seemed increasingly focused on material things rather than relationships. They're good children, I would reassure her. We raised them right, they're just finding their way in the world. I believed that then, I wanted to believe it. The alternative that our success had somehow spoiled them, that our desire to provide had created. Expectation rather than appreciation was too painful to consider seriously. The first real crack in my faith in our family's foundation appeared in 2015, when Catherine was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The diagnosis came suddenly, during what should have been a routine physical. One day she was planning her summer garden, the next we were sitting in an oncologist's office learning words like aggressive, metastatic, and palliative care. I expected our children to rally around us to provide the same kind of support we had always given them. Instead, I found myself navigating Catherine's illness largely alone. Michael was swamped at work, unable to take time off for doctor appointments or treatment sessions. He would call occasionally, asking for updates, but always keeping the conversations brief. When I suggested he might want to spend more time with his mother while she was still feeling relatively well, he assured me they would have plenty of time for that later. Helena was dealing with her own crisis, a gallery showing that hadn't sold as many pieces as she'd hoped, financial pressures that made it impossible to travel home frequently. She loved her mother, she assured me, but she had to focus on her career right now. Surely I understood that. Andrew was the most present physically, but his visits were often stressful. He would arrive with grand plans to cheer Mom up, then become frustrated when she was too tired for elaborate activities. He meant well, but his inability to simply sit quietly with her, to accept that sometimes just being present was enough, often left Catherine more exhausted than before he came. I found myself carrying the weight of Catherine's illness, managing her medications, coordinating with doctors, helping her maintain her dignity as her body betrayed her while trying to maintain the fiction that our children were just busy, rather than absent when we needed them most. Catherine never complained about their absence, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes when promised visits were canceled, when phone calls were postponed, when their own problems took precedence over her declining health. She was too proud to ask for more than they were willing to give, too loving to criticize them even when their neglect was obvious. Catherine passed away on a rainy Thursday morning in October 2016. She died peacefully, holding my hand in the hospital room where I had spent most of the previous 3 weeks sleeping in an uncomfortable chair, wanting to be there for every moment we had left. The funeral was well attended. Our friends, neighbors, business associates, and church family filled the small chapel to overflowing. Catherine had touched many lives during her 68 years, and their presence was a comfort during those dark days, but even in grief I noticed things that troubled me. Michael was more concerned with the funeral arrangements' cost than their appropriateness. Helena spent most of the visitation period networking with Catherine's artist friends rather than receiving condolences. Andrew seemed impatient with the entire process, checking his phone frequently and making comments about getting back to real life. After the burial, family and friends gathered at our home for the traditional meal. I had hired caterers to handle the food, wanting to spare myself the burden of hosting duties while grieving. As people shared memories of Catherine, I found myself thinking about how she would have loved hearing these stories, how she would have graciously thanked everyone for coming, how she would have made sure every person felt welcomed and valued. Late that evening, after the guests had gone home and I was sitting alone in the house Catherine and I had shared for nearly 20 years, Michael approached me with a manila folder in his hands. "Dad," he said, settling into Catherine's favorite chair without seeming to notice the significance of that action. We need to talk about Mom's estate and, well, about your situation, my situation, as if being a widower was a problem to be solved rather than a loss to be mourned. What do you mean? I asked, though something in his tone made me wary. Well, you're 71 now, this house is too big for one person, and honestly, Dad, managing your finances at your age, maybe it's time to consider some changes. Helena and Andrew had moved closer, and I realized this conversation had been planned, rehearsed perhaps. The funeral had been just the opening act. This was the main event. What kind of changes? I asked carefully. Practical ones, Helena said, pulling out her phone to show me pictures. We've been looking at some really nice senior communities, places where you wouldn't have to worry about home maintenance or cooking for yourself, places with activities and people your own age. And Andrew added, places where your money would go further. You could sell this house, invest the proceeds more conservatively, maybe set up trust funds for your grandchildren's education. Grandchildren. Michael had 2 young daughters I saw perhaps 3 times a year. Helena was unmarried and had made it clear that children weren't in her plans. Andrew had been married twice but had no children from either relationship. I see, I said slowly. And you've discussed this among yourselves. We're worried about you, Dad, Michael said, though his tone suggested he was more worried about something else entirely. Living alone in this big house, managing all these financial decisions by yourself. It's a lot of responsibility for someone your age, someone my age, as if 71 was ancient, as if I had somehow become incompetent overnight. Over the following months, the pressure increased gradually but persistently. Phone calls that began with inquiries about my health quickly shifted to questions about my finances. Visits that were supposedly social, somehow always included discussions about planning for the future and making smart decisions while you still can. They presented their arguments carefully, reasonably. The house was indeed too large for one person. Maintenance was becoming more expensive each year. The neighborhood was changing, property values were uncertain. Wouldn't I be happier somewhere with built-in social opportunities and professional management? But I began to notice other things too. Michael had started mentioning his own financial pressures more frequently, his daughter's private school tuition, his wife Patricia's desire to remodel their kitchen, the strain of supporting an upper-middle-class lifestyle on his salary alone. Helena talked about opportunities in her art career that required capital investment, gallery fees, and promotional expenses that could make the difference between success and failure. Andrew discussed business ventures he wanted to pursue, investment opportunities that just needed initial funding to generate significant returns. None of them asked directly for money. They were too sophisticated for such crude approaches. Instead, they painted pictures of futures where my resources could benefit everyone, where selling the house and simplifying my life would create opportunities for the whole family to thrive. I found myself caught between 2 competing realities. On one hand, their arguments weren't entirely unreasonable. I was living alone in a large house. I was getting older and would eventually need to make changes to accommodate aging. Planning ahead was sensible. On the other hand, I felt increasingly like I was being managed rather than consulted, pressured rather than supported. Their concerns seemed less about my well-being than about positioning themselves to benefit from whatever decisions I made. The tipping point came during Christmas dinner 2018. All 3 children were present with their respective partners, and the conversation inevitably turned to my situation, but this time they had brought documents. Dad, Michael said, producing a folder I'd learned to dread, we've been working with a financial planner who specializes in estate management for seniors. He's prepared some projections showing how different strategies could maximize your security while providing opportunities for family investment. The papers he spread on Catherine's dining room table were impressive charts and graphs, projections and scenarios, all designed to show how liquidating my assets and restructuring my finances could benefit everyone involved. There were provisions for my care, of course, but also detailed plans for how the remaining funds could be optimally deployed for family benefit. I studied the documents quietly while they talked, pointing out features and advantages, explaining how this approach would simplify everything for me while creating opportunities for them. The language was careful, professional, but the intent was clear. They wanted control of my money, and they wanted it while I was still alive to provide it voluntarily. This is very thorough, I said finally. How long have you been working on this? A few months, Helena admitted. We wanted to make sure we had all the options mapped out before presenting anything to you. A few months. While I had been mourning Catherine, learning to live alone, adjusting to widowerhood, my children had been meeting with financial planners and calculating how to redistribute my assets. I need time to think about this, I told them. The disappointed looks they exchanged told me everything I needed to know about their expectations. Spring 2019 brought what I now recognize as the beginning of the end. The subtle pressures became less subtle. The reasonable suggestions became demands. The family concern became barely disguised impatience. It started with small things. Michael began questioning my purchases. Why did I need a new truck when the old one was still Running, Helena criticized my charitable donations as excessive given my situation. Andrew suggested I was being taken advantage of by contractors and service providers who charged elderly people inflated prices. They had appointed themselves guardians of my financial well-being, and they seemed to believe this gave them veto power over my decisions. The breaking point came in June, during what was supposed to be a casual family barbecue. I had recently purchased a small travel trailer, thinking I might enjoy some camping trips to places Catherine and I had always planned to visit together. The trailer was modest, nothing fancy, just a comfortable way for an old man to see some country without the hassle of hotels and restaurant meals. When Michael saw it parked in my driveway, his reaction was immediate and harsh. "Dad, what the hell is this?" The profanity surprised me. Michael had always been the most controlled of my children, the most careful with his language and presentation. "It's a travel trailer," I said calmly. "I thought I might take some trips this summer." "Do you have any idea how much this cost?" Helena demanded, walking around the trailer as if it were evidence of a crime. "And at your age, Dad, this is exactly the kind of impulsive decision-making we've been worried about." "I'm 73, I replied, "not 93. I'm perfectly capable of managing a small trailer." "Are you?" Andrew joined the attack. "Because honestly, Dad, some of your decisions lately make us wonder if you're thinking clearly." The accusation hung in the air between us. Were they suggesting I was mentally incompetent, that my decision to purchase a travel trailer was evidence of cognitive decline? "What decisions?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to hear the answer. They had a list ready. The trailer was just the latest example. There was also the new roof I'd had installed on the house, unnecessary and expensive, the donations I'd made to the church building fund, excessive, and my refusal to meet with their financial planner again, stubborn and unreasonable. Everything I had done to maintain my independence and continue living as I chose was being reinterpreted as evidence that I needed their intervention. "We're trying to help you, Dad," Michael said, his tone suggesting he was being patient with a difficult child. "But you have to meet us halfway. You can't keep making major financial decisions without consulting us first." "Consulting you," the words came out sharper than I intended. "About decisions involving my money and my life. Your money that's supposed to be our inheritance," Helena said, then immediately looked like she regretted the honesty. There it was, the truth beneath all the concern and careful planning. They weren't worried about my well-being. They were worried about their inheritance. They had already mentally spent money that was still mine, made plans for resources I was still using, and they were frustrated that I wasn't cooperating with their timeline. "I see," I said quietly. "I think you should all leave now." The shocked expressions on their faces suggested they hadn't expected such a direct response. They were accustomed to me listening patiently to their concerns, considering their suggestions, accommodating their preferences. They weren't prepared for me to simply end the conversation. "Dad, don't be like this," Andrew said. "We're family. We're supposed to be able to talk about difficult things." "We just did," I replied. "Now I'd like you to leave." They left, but not before making it clear they considered my reaction unreasonable and hurtful. I was being stubborn. I was making things difficult for everyone. I was acting like they were the enemy when they were just trying to help. But as I watched their cars disappear down my driveway, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: relief. For the first time since Catherine's death, I was alone. By choice rather than by circumstance, the weeks following that confrontation were surprisingly peaceful. No phone calls pressuring me to reconsider my attitude. No visits with folders full of financial projections. No helpful suggestions about how I should be living my life. I used the travel trailer for exactly what I'd intended: a series of short trips to places Catherine and I had talked about visiting. I drove to the mountains where we'd honeymooned, parked by the lake where we taught our children to fish, spent quiet evenings watching sunsets over landscapes that held decades of memories. Those trips gave me time to think clearly, away from the familiar surroundings that were so full of both comfort and grief. I began to understand that my children's behavior wasn't really about money, though money was certainly part of it. It was about power and control, about their need to feel important and involved in decisions that affected them only indirectly. But it was also about something more fundamental. They had stopped seeing me as a person with my own agency and started viewing me as a resource to be managed. The man who had built a successful business, navigated decades of marriage, raised 3 children, and created a comfortable life through careful planning and hard work had somehow become, in their minds, an elderly person who needed their protection from his own poor judgment. When I returned from my longest trip, 2 weeks exploring Civil War battlefields throughout Virginia, I found my mailbox stuffed with urgent messages. Michael had called my neighbors asking if they'd seen me. Helena had contacted my doctor inquiring about my mental state. Andrew had actually driven by the house several times, noting which lights were on and whether my mail was accumulating. They had apparently convinced themselves that my absence was evidence of either an emergency or further proof of my declining judgment. The possibility that I was simply enjoying my Retirement and independence hadn't occurred to them. The confrontation that followed was uglier than our previous disagreements. They accused me of being irresponsible, inconsiderate, and selfish. How could I simply disappear without telling anyone where I was going? What if something had happened? What if they had needed to reach me? But beneath their expressed concern was unmistakable anger. I had acted independently, made decisions without their input, spent my own money on my own priorities. In their minds, this was not just inconsiderate, it was insubordinate. "This proves our point, Dad," Michael said during what would turn out to be our final family meeting. "You can't just take off without telling anyone. You're not 25 anymore. You have responsibilities." "What responsibilities?" I asked. "To whom?" "To us," Helena said simply. "We're your family. We have a right to know what's going on in your life, a right to know." As if my autonomy had an expiration date, as if reaching a certain age meant surrendering my privacy and independence to my adult children. "I'm not sure you do have that right," I said carefully. "I'm not incapacitated. I'm not dependent on you for care or support. I'm a competent adult making reasonable decisions about my own life." "Are you?" Andrew's question was direct and challenging. "Because from where we sit, it looks like you're making increasingly poor choices and refusing to listen to reason." "Whose reason?" I asked. "Yours, the reason that suggests I should liquidate my assets and restructure my life according to your preferences." The room fell silent. We had finally reached the heart of the conflict, and none of us could pretend it was really about my well-being anymore. "We just want what's best for everyone," Michael said finally. "Everyone meaning you," I replied. "What you want is control over resources that don't belong to you yet. You want me to make decisions based on your needs rather than my own. You want me to become a managed asset rather than continuing to live as an independent person." The accuracy of my assessment was reflected in their faces. They looked like children caught in misbehavior, angry at being exposed, defensive about their motives, but unable to deny the fundamental truth of what I'd said. "If that's really what you think of us," Helena said, tears starting in her eyes, "then maybe we shouldn't bother trying to help you anymore." It was meant as a threat, I think. They expected me to back down, to apologize, to acknowledge their good intentions and agree to compromise. They certainly didn't expect me to nod calmly and say, "Maybe you're right." Summer became autumn and autumn became winter, with minimal contact between my children and me. Occasional phone calls, brief and formal, a few holiday cards, no visits, no pressure, no helpful suggestions about how I should be living my life. I discovered that I didn't miss the drama. Without the constant stress of defending my choices and explaining my decisions, I found a peace I hadn't experienced since Catherine's illness began. I established new routines, deepened existing friendships, explored interests I had set aside during the busy years of building my business and raising my family, but I also began to plan. If my children truly believed I was incapable of managing my own affairs, if they genuinely thought my independence was a problem that needed solving, then perhaps it was time to test the sincerity of their concern. I had always been a methodical person, approaching problems systematically and executing solutions carefully. The situation with my children was simply another problem that required a systematic approach. First, I needed to understand exactly where I stood financially. I spent several weeks with my accountant and financial advisor, reviewing every asset, every investment, every potential source of income and expense. The picture that emerged was better than I had expected. Decades of careful planning and conservative investing had created genuine financial security. I could maintain my current lifestyle indefinitely, afford whatever care I might eventually need, and still leave a substantial inheritance. But more importantly, I had options. Liquid assets that could be quickly moved or donated, property that could be sold or transferred, investments that could be redirected toward different purposes entirely. Second, I needed to determine exactly what my children's real priorities were. Did they truly believe I needed their protection and guidance, or were their concerns primarily financial, focused more on preserving their eventual inheritance than ensuring my well-being? The test I devised was simple but revealing. I would create a situation that appeared to threaten their financial interests while posing no real risk to my well-being. Their response would tell me everything I needed to know about their true motivations. Spring 2020 brought the perfect opportunity to test my children's priorities. The COVID-19 pandemic had created market volatility, social isolation, and genuine uncertainty about the future. It was a time when adult children might reasonably worry about elderly parents and when financial concerns might naturally arise. I began making subtle changes to my behavior and communication that would suggest I was struggling with isolation and perhaps making questionable decisions. Nothing dramatic or alarming, but enough to trigger their concerns if they were genuinely monitoring my well-being. I stopped answering my phone immediately, letting calls go to voicemail before responding hours later with brief, slightly confused-sounding messages. I mentioned feeling overwhelmed by financial paperwork and uncertain about investment decisions. I asked seemingly naive questions about technology and expressed frustration with managing online banking and bill paying. Most significantly, I began talking about a new friend I had met, a woman named Dorothy who had recently moved to town and was helping me navigate some of the challenges of pandemic life. I was deliberately vague about Dorothy's background and our relationship, allowing my children to draw their own conclusions about whether this friendship might represent a threat to their interests. The response was immediate and predictable. Within days of my first mention of Dorothy, all three children had called, suddenly concerned about my social isolation and emotional vulnerability. Was I being careful about COVID exposure? Was I sure I could trust someone I had just met? Had I considered that older people were often targeted by scammers and predators? But the questions that revealed their real concerns came next. Was Dorothy helping me with financial decisions? Had I given her access to any accounts or important documents? Was I considering making any changes to my estate planning? None of them asked what I needed or how they could help. None of them offered to visit, even safely, or suggested ways to address the isolation and confusion I had claimed to be experiencing. Their entire focus was on the potential threat this new relationship might pose to their financial interests. The test's climax came when I mentioned that Dorothy and I were discussing the possibility of traveling together once pandemic restrictions lifted. We had talked about maybe selling both our houses and buying a smaller place that would be easier to maintain. The phone calls became daily occurrences. Michael wanted to meet Dorothy immediately to assess her intentions. Helena offered to help me research any major decisions I might be considering. Andrew suggested I should slow down and think carefully before making any irreversible changes to my living situation. But still, none of them asked what would make me happy or what I actually needed from them. Their concern was entirely focused on protecting assets they considered theirs, rather than supporting my right to make my own choices about companionship and living arrangements. By summer 2020, I had learned everything I needed to know about my children's priorities. Their concern for my well-being was secondary to their concern for their inheritance. Their desire to help me was really a desire to control me. Their family love came with conditions I was no longer willing to accept, but I needed one final test to be absolutely certain. Something that would remove all ambiguity about their motivations and give me complete clarity about how to proceed.